Hello to all. I am Diana Mackay with the Institute for Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University. And I'd like to welcome you formally to this webinar on women in science and gender equity. I have just one or two customary reminders before we get started. Please note that the session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available on our Institute's website, which is www.aku.edu/IGHD. And I will post that link in the chat momentarily. Second, as we have many people participating, we have enabled some features on Zoom that facilitate your involvement. Please do make use of the chat function. I encourage you to introduce yourselves by name and organization. Please be sure to note that using the drop-down menu in the chat box, you need to select everyone, or all attendees and hosts and panelists. I believe it's listed there as everyone at the moment for this Zoom meeting. And if you do that, then everybody will be able to see your introduction. If you send it only to the hosts and the panelists, only the hosts and the panelists will see it. So please be sure to ensure that your comments reach everybody that's participating by using that little pull-down menu in the chat function. We've also enabled the Q&A function, which we would like you to use for posting specific questions that you'd like the hosts and the moderators and speakers to address in the discussion. So you can introduce yourselves in the chat, but use the Q&A function for your specific questions for the discussion. And following the webinar, you are always welcome to communicate with us at the Institute for Global Health and Development by email, and I will post my email address in the chat, enabling you to do so. Finally, this webinar is accredited by the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education. For those requesting it, an e-certificate can be provided after the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to turn to Dr. Zulfiqar Bhutta, Director of the Aga Khan University's Institute for Global Health and Development. Dr. Bhutta, in turn, will be introducing our speakers, but in the interest of time, I will be posting short bios for all of them in the chat, so please do have a look. Dr. Bhutta, over to you.
Thank you very much for kicking us off, Diana, as usual, and for making the introduction to the session. As the founding director of the Institute for Global Health and Development at the Aga Khan University, it is my proud privilege to welcome you to our 7th webinar. And it's amazing how, despite the pandemic and all the restrictions that it has placed on face-to-face meetings and workshops, how much has been possible to achieve through these virtual educational sessions. And of course, there are many advantages. Notable amongst those are its eco-friendliness, in that we don't add to the global carbon footprint, and that we are able to meet many colleagues that would otherwise be very difficult to assemble under one roof at any one given point in time. So I've been particularly impressed by how these webinars have attracted students from not only Pakistan, but East Africa, low and middle income countries in general, and also from high income countries. And some of the topics that we have covered as part of our series of webinars over the last year have been truly things that are many of the global wicked problems that we currently encounter. They include things like climate change, health and development, the issues of agriculture, nutrition, food systems, water and global health, sustainable development goals and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected them. And very recently, the webinar that we held between Afghanistan and Pakistan just a few days before things turned on their head on the issue of women and children's health in conflict settings and emergencies. Today's webinar on women and women in science and global health is very topical because we have had a previous webinar on the same subject last year. And this time we are focusing on this from the context of practical implications and impact of this issue in various regions. We are very grateful that we have a panel which is absolutely stellar. And as Diana said, we have posted their bios on the web, and therefore I will not go through those in detail. But it's my great privilege to introduce all three of them in the order that they will be presenting. So Professor Hoda Rashad, who is just recently appointed as our International Advisory Committee member to the Institute for Global Health and Development. And thank you for accepting that position, Hoda. She's the professor and director of the Social Research Center at the American University of Cairo. And to students of issues of anthropology and gender studies, Hoda is no stranger. She has done stellar work with the United Nations and with academia in both Egypt and elsewhere. She was a notable member of the WHO's famous EAT Commission that looked at the global impact of obesity. And she's been a member of several advisory committees within the WHO Eastern Mediterranean region and also a member of the ACHR Global. She's served as a member of the National Council for Women in Egypt and a member of the Senate, the Shura Council of one of the two parliamentary bodies in Egypt. And it'll be fantastic to hear her speak today on the issue of gender equity framing and its implications. She'll be followed by one of our own from a very distinguished Aga Khan University faculty member, Professor Amina AbuBakar, who is the director of the Institute for Human Development across the Aga Khan University campuses. And she's also a senior research scientist at the Kenya Medical Research Institute, commonly called KEMRI, and the Wellcome Trust Research Program. She's also a visiting academic at the University of Oxford. So Amina is a trained developmental psychologist, and amongst her various things, claim to fame is that she has developed a series of neurodevelopmental tools and measures that are now being implemented in quite a number, actually more than 24 low and middle income countries. And that's one of the greatest contributions that an academic can in terms of improving knowledge. And she was a highly rewarded scientist, and in 2016, she was given the very highly prestigious MRC Difford African Research Leader Fellowship. And Amina will be talking to us particularly about the topic that we have in relevance to Sub-Saharan Africa. And our last speaker for the session today is my dear friend, Professor Stephen Kennedy, who was formerly the head of Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Nuffield Oxford Hospital. He is a professor of reproductive medicine at the Nuffield Department of Women and Reproductive Health at University of Oxford, and the co-director of the Oxford Maternal and Perinatal Health Institute. His claim to fame is none of these, but that he was one of the lead investigators of the famous Intergrowth 21 project, which has led to, Stephen might correct me, perhaps close to 70 notable high-impact publications. It's changed the landscape of how fetal growth standards are measured, and he's followed that by looking at InterBio, which then completes the field in terms of assessing it in various pathological conditions. And he'll be speaking to us again today on women in science and some of these issues from the context of how his group at Oxford has looked at this. So, as I said, I have not been able to do justice to our worthy panel, and you can get all of those details off the web. But I know that everyone's anticipating these talks very closely, and I'd like to give them maximum time. They have 15 minutes each, and we will not interrupt their presentation, but have questions and answers at the end of that, which I hope will be quite a robust discussion on this topic itself. So let me start by inviting Professor Hoda Rashad to speak to us by setting the scene in the context of gender equity framing and its implications. Hoda, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Many thanks for taking time to join us. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the issues around women in science in Sub-Saharan Africa. I believe several of these may be relevant in different contexts, but I've just focused on Sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. So the key issue when you think about women and science in Sub-Saharan Africa is that really women scientists can play a very important role in addressing some of the key developmental challenges in Africa. For instance, women can have a major contribution towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are several persistent gender disparity issues that really exclude women and girls from achieving their potential and therefore exclude them from effectively contributing towards addressing the developmental challenges in our context. Next, please. So when we think about the challenge we have in terms of gender inequity, there are actually two aspects. We really do have a challenge in attracting women into science. If you look at the statistics that are presented by UNESCO, is that none of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa has actually achieved gender parity in terms of women being in the scientific field. Some countries are doing much better than others, so there are also regional and country level disparity. For instance, if you look at South Africa, we are looking at 43.7% participation, and yet in countries such as Senegal, it is 24.9%, and others it's even much lower. However, the challenge is not just attracting women into science. The challenge is actually there are even fewer women able to reach leadership position. So even the few who get into science, sometimes they don't stay long enough to become leaders or don't get an opportunity. I actually remember one of these moments that are very eye-opening in my field. I'm a psychologist by training, where a colleague noted that in many undergraduate psychology classes, it's very female field. But as we move forward to get the senior professors, the most cited psychologists, then many of them will be males. So the issue is not just about attracting, but how do we retain females until they get leadership positions in our settings. Next, please. So while I was thinking about how do you really put down the barriers about women participation in science, I came across a very recent study by the African Academy of Science that actually, interviewed a lot of women about their challenges, what have been the barriers, and I thought I would highlight this study as a way to frame the discussions and to allow us to look into some of the potential solutions. So what is this? I've put there a link for those who would like to look at the details of this report. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of the background, this study was commissioned by the African Academy of Science as part of a very exciting initiative, which shows that, very many people in the continent are trying to think, how can we address this gender gap? It was a mixed method study that had both quantitative and qualitative, and they had more than 396 women in science contribute. They looked at barriers and facilitators. The study mainly looked at STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and medicine, but I think it covers so many of the other things and provides really an opportunity for female scientists in whatever field to reflect on their challenges. Next. So one of the key findings from this study is one core barrier for many female scientists in Africa is patriarchal attitudes, values and beliefs that sometimes, become a barrier for women to take up positions in STEM. For instance, there is a traditional perception about women's place is not in hard sciences, so they need to go maybe for whatever is considered softer sciences, but they're also put in maybe more supportive roles due to sociocultural norms, and this really sometimes reflect themselves in terms of caregiving and family responsibilities that women who have careers have to bear. So they end up having quite a huge burden, but also because there's discrimination in terms of women accessing decision-making position, many of the decisions being made in terms of women, issues that would affect careers of women, of girls, are being made largely by male panels. So I think this stood out as a very big impediment for women to be attracted and to stay into scientific careers. Next. But the other issue was really around the work environment and related factors. So many of the women who were interviewed considered that they faced barriers that very few women, very few men would face in their career. They were expected to work much harder to prove themselves. But even in that case, more preferences was given to males in terms of recruitment and promotion, and women found themselves to have very few advancement opportunities. So the key thing around that is that the work environment was not very supportive to their career development and for them to get promoted and move into leadership position. Next, please. So, but there are also individual level factors which are very interesting. The key one that actually caught my eye was the issue of self-esteem and believing in themselves. You know, like one woman mentioned, that is a quote, yeah, that they were the first time they were told that they could go and study engineering, they thought, wow, can I do this? Can I really manage? Would I be able to succeed? So many a times women doubted themselves. But I think this, as a psychologist, I see this as arising from very early socialization practices where maybe they were not, you know, encouraged to take this up and they learned to doubt themselves. In fact, I remember one time we went for a conference where one of the key standing issues for me was a study that highlighted that there was a culture in Africa whereby girls were not encouraged to speak in public, you know, to say their opinion, because they might embarrass themselves, they might embarrass their families, and therefore teachers stayed in class with students who rarely raised their hands. And I think this has some long-term impact because there have been studies where even women do not, you know, actually put themselves forward for leadership position or do not have the confidence to negotiate for equal pay in some setting. So this really brings out the issue about how best can we socialize girls very early for success and full participation in the society. Next, please. So the respondents also are asked about some of the facilitators for their own careers. What are some of the things that they saw helped them really do well? And here I'm highlighting some of those that were very common. I can't go from, you know, through each of them, but some of those things that really stand out, including having role models, people they can look up who have succeeded and done well, but also having mentors and supervisors who are able to to support them, to encourage them, and to, you know, to hold their hands through the process of career development. And then also you can see that for those who succeeded, they did say they had work environments that actively recruited for diversity. They were also able to, you know, get policies that supported them when they had new children and needed to leave and things like that. And therefore, it's really solidified the fact that it's multiple factors that contribute to being barriers for women joining and staying into science in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next, please. So how can we contribute to closing this gap? I'm just going to look at, my colleagues and I have made a proposal. We are waiting for funding confirmation to really set up a network to support women who want to go into neuroscience in Africa. And we've come up with various, some of the proposals we feel are responding to the issues raised by the other, by the females who are interviewed. One of the key things is we've actually set up a network that is female-led to support females. On the other hand, it does not exclude males. So we have several male co-Is because we feel that to achieve this, we need to bring everyone along. And we actually have proposed a recruitment strategy that would be 70-30, so that we try to encourage and target more females, but also include males in the program. Next, please. So one of the things we are proposing is to really start early, you know, like school engagement programs for girls while they're in secondary schools, you know, to raise awareness on the different careers that are there as scientists, so that they can know this. I think as I grew up, there was hardly any programs raising awareness on the opportunities that are there in science, which sometimes means that young girls do not know of their options. But also we've proposed brief internships and work placement in between school holidays or school transitions, So let's say students who have finished their O levels and are still waiting to either go to A levels or to go to the university can have like 3 months work placement in our research programs, where they could actually be exposed to the kind of research we do, to labs, to different kind of scientific inquiry, so that we can raise their interest very early before they make their choices of career. Next, please. But we are also thinking of having really supportive recruitment and work environment. For instance, encourage and target female applicants. So it's not just about putting an advert out there. Sometimes we need to go into these programs and, you know, talk to people as they about existing, what is it called? Existing opportunities and how they can see their careers developing. And we as mentors being there to talk to people through their career choices so that we encourage more female applicants, but also as part of the program, really look at what are the fair compensation and promotion practices that ensure that women feel or women actually get properly compensated for their efforts and they're able to move through the career ladder. Next, please. But also, you know, this came out through consultation a lot. There is a need for supportive working environment. For instance, flexible working hours when needed. If there is one of the few things we have learned through COVID is the fact that people can actually work from home, can have flexible shifts and still deliver and achieve. And I hope this can be used to encourage more women to join the career in science, because there are moments in life when women have to have more caregiving duties, which may, you know, mean that they need that flexibility, but also career re-entry programs for those who take a break. Structured mentorship. In our context, structured mentorship is lacking a lot, and many people look at this as a major gap in terms of supportive career development. But also during our consultation, one of the things that came out clearly is the need for more training and skill building on issues such as leadership and negotiation skills. Next, please. But I feel that the challenge in getting women and girls into science really start at community and family level. So really in the African context, there's a need to address practices, norms, and beliefs that limit women participation in science. And one of these is really to have active community engagement that highlights the contribution by female scientists. You know, it's interesting when these stories are being told of success, many a times you do not hear the successes of female scientists and their contribution. And I think this means that the younger kids lack a mentor, someone to look up to. So we feel this would be a really important contribution in terms of attracting more people into science, more women. Next, please. So in conclusion, to really close the gender gap in science in sub-Saharan Africa, we really need policies and interventions at multiple levels to remove barriers for women to be able to achieve that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amina. Let me just double check if we have Dr. Hoda Rashad back online. And
yes, I'm available.
Yes, she's there.
Yes.
I'm available, yes.
If you could kindly share your screen. I had tried to introduce you, and I know we had connection problems. But let's follow from that and have you present on gender equity framing and its implications. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Zulfiqar. I'm not putting the video on because I'm worried of technological problem. I do apologize for the disruption. My intervention, or the objective of my intervention, is to indicate the importance of mainstreaming an equity lens in gender analysis. It's
and
quite
Hoda,
important
if I could interrupt you just for a second.
Like to
we can see your slides, but
sure.
If you don't mind, would you try putting them in presentation mode for us?
Full screen.
Sure, I'll do that.
Okay, great, thanks.
So basically, I want to highlight the implications of adopting the gender equity framing on research and policies. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to note that the equity framing could be used in relation to any dimension of gender inequality. So we're talking about gender concerns in the science field, and we can apply this framing to it. However, my presentation will provide an example of an application of this equity framing in the health field. So the intervention will be divided into 3 parts. I will start by discussing the importance of the equity framing in general, and then what are the steps of applying it, followed by a demonstration and an example from using real data.
Well, we still don't have your full slides. I mean,
I thought I do.
Khalid,
is not the full slide? I'm asking. I think
click on the slideshow button for the, yeah, this one.
At the bottom. Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So why do we care about equity framing? The reason we care about equity framing because it is different from an inequality framing. The equity framing adds a value judgment to the causes of the inequality. It captures our concerns with the fairness of the inequality. So actually, when we talk about inequity, there will be a difference between normalizing the social patterns as expected, social inequalities, and between recognizing that the inequalities that we're observing, they speak about our society. They are disturbing signal of injustices. So it's very important to probe whether the inequality that we're following is equitable or not. Equity is important because now we recognize it's a social success. We know that unfair states are not developed ones. We know that inequities produce polarization in society, and it severely negatively impacts the livelihoods of people and their well-being. So if you investigate the inequalities and you establish that these inequalities are unfair, it gives you an ethical rationale for action. It provides an urgency for the need to act. And really, I must recognize that nowadays, the whole development community is very much concerned about inequality. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, you look at Goal 10, it speaks of inequality. The goals request disaggregation at the level of all indicators. So this in itself demonstrates to us that the international body recognizes the danger of inequality. However, the international body, in terms of the SDG, has not focused as much on inequity as they should. It's the public health discourse that has gone one step further. The public health discourse pushes equity to the forefront. It brings the attention to the structural forces that produces those inequality. It speaks of the causes of the causes, and it speaks whether those causes are fair or unfair. So now that we recognize that fairness of the inequality that we observed is a real concern, let me remind you of 3 features that need to occur if we're really interested with inequality. The first, you have to look at the distribution of inequality, not just the differences between 2 groups or the gap. You have to look at the causes of these inequalities. And your objective in doing that is to try to support the achievement of a fair distribution of social categories. So the objective of the inequity framing is to work on social transformation anchored on justice and equity. Your objective is to change the distribution of disadvantage, not just to look at the group that is disadvantaged. So that's, generally speaking, that's the literature about equity. If we are thinking of gender inequality analysis or gender equity analysis, there are 4 steps that needs to happen. I will not elaborate on them because I will demonstrate them in the next example. The first step is you need to have gender categories. And this is a very different way of dealing with gender that I will explain. And then you investigate whatever outcome measure you're interested in, whether it's in the science field, whether it's the health field, among the different gender categories. The third step, which is the very difficult step, is you want to understand whether those observed inequalities are fair or not. I'll remind you with the definition in the literature about unfair differences. They are systematic differences in outcome measures among gender categories. They are deemed unfair if they are unnecessary or preventable. So any inequality you have that you feel should not have occurred, or you can do something about it, then it's inequitable. Finally, you have to think of your policy implications. Let me go quickly to an example that will give you details or explain a little bit more what I mean. Because of the time of the presentation, of course, I will not dwell on the details of that example, but I suggest that there are 2 references. If you're interested, you can look at them. There is the reference itself and the URL. It will give you much, much more detail than what I'm trying to do in this following 5 minutes. So the first step is to think of gender categories. Usually in gender analysis, we differentiate between the 2 sexes, and we say it's a gender analysis if we show that these differences are caused by social constructs, not just sex differences. However, in the case of gender equity, what we can do is think of the social constructs is to divide them into different categories. You can think of different groupings. For example, the most conservative group, a conservative group, less conservative, or least conservative, or whatever terminology you would like. The most important point here is that we are recognizing that gender is not one category that impact all groups in society the same ways. They are different categories of gender constructs in the same society. So gender is just not one variable. And this is basically the first innovation that I'm proposing in the analysis. This has not been done extensively, but reflect on it and you will find that what I'm saying is correct. In your society, when you speak of gender, it doesn't affect every social group the same way. So what we've done is we've created an index of social norms. I'll not go into the details, and we divided it into 4 categories. The second step is to ask ourselves, is the output measure or the outcome measure that I'm interested in this case, we were interested in reproductive health in Egypt. So we asked ourselves, does the social groupings of gender produce inequality in the outcome measure, or it doesn't produce inequality? The next table is really the summary table that I'd like you to look at, and don't bother about the details of it. At the first column is just the indicator, like whether we're talking about neonatal mortality, we're talking about violence, we're talking about early age at marriage, whatever. So at the first column speaks of the indicator. But look at the details of this table in terms of color. In the most conservative group, we find the worst outcomes. In the least, the red is prevalent. If you go one step further, you find that the red decreases and the green start to appear. When you go to the least conservative group, you find that the green is appearing. So basically what this tells us is that the most conservative group suffer the worst indicators of health. The columns that follow is the average indicator. The last one is a measure of inequality. When the measure is above 10, then it's very severe. When it's below 10, then the group is unequal. It's a summary measure of the distribution on the 4 gender categories. So basically, what we discovered is that there are significant inequality of outcomes by social categories of gender. We also discovered something else which is very important. When you have a priority health condition, an average priority health condition, this priority health condition could be equal or unequal. So there are cases when we have conditions that are very high and their inequality is very high. This is the red box. There are other cases when we have an indicator that doesn't tell us it's an inequality indicator. It's not high, it's not a priority, but the inequality is very high. For example, marital violence. Marital violence in general is not a priority inequality concern. However, it's a general concern. It's a priority concern. So now this is the most important step. I know I'm running quickly because of the time, but I'm trying to share the basic idea. The last steps is to ask ourselves, we're finding observed inequalities according to gender. Are they fair? And what should we tell the policymaker? What are the policy recommendations that should come up out of these findings? I'll give you 3 findings and 3 policy recommendations, and I will stop at that. The first finding is that the distribution of gender norm is a significant force in the observed inequality. So if you want to change the outcome measure, it's not enough to have uniform policy. It's not enough to target the most disadvantaged group. It's not enough to try to change behavior. What you should do is you should try to change the inequality of the environment of behavior. You should target this inequality in gender norms. You should ask yourself why it appears. How can I handle it? How can I reduce the inequality? Because it makes a big difference in the outcome measure. My second finding, and I haven't touched on it here, but in the analysis, deprivation interacts with culture to shape gender inequality. So the more deprived the group are, the worse their gender norms. And this means that since deprivation is not fairly divided, then this whole gender inequality is unfair. So your recommendation to the policymaker who are really keen on changing the gender outcome, you tell them that gender policies, yes, are important because they have their own entry culture point, but they should not pursue gender policies separately from developmental policies. So while you're intervening on the gender aspect, you really have to intervene on the social aspect as well, on education, employment, poverty alleviation, and so on. My third finding is that if you adopt an intervention and you don't recognize this inequality in the gender norm, then your intervention is unfair. There is a term now in public health that was really introduced by Michael Marmot, and it talks about proportional universality approach. It's a kind of a positive discrimination approach. Basically, this approach, yes, says that we should have certain universal intervention, but we should always take into account that this intervention have a differentiated impact on different gender groups. So to conclude, the equity framing in relation to gender, it focuses on distribution of gender constructs in our society. It asks why this distribution occurs, more importantly, how to influence such a distribution. When we do that, we move the analytical investigation towards the fairness of upstream and structural determinants. We find ourselves introducing more integrated and multi-level and context-sensitive gender policies and action. We should adopt a differentiated gender approach, recognizing the distribution of gender construct in the population. So really my concluding remark is, this is a new way of analyzing gender, and I suggest that we all reflect on it and we try to develop the methodology that can capture it better, but more importantly, try to guide policies that are more effective in terms of handling gender. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hoda. And just to remind the audience, please kindly send your Q&A questions into the Q&A box, and also we may throw this open and have people just ask questions from the floor. So you'll have to raise your hands. So our final speaker before we go on to the discussion is Stephen Kennedy from Oxford, who's been introduced, and he'll speak to us on gender inequality in science with reference to initiatives in the UK. Stephen.
Thanks, Zulfi. So my talk is in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to try to quantify the extent to which women around the world are disadvantaged and what some of the underlying causes and barriers are to explain that inequality. And in the second half, I'm going to describe to you what has been happening here in the UK to address the issue of inequality, and some personal experience of mine in implementing these changes when I was head of the university department. For those of you who are interested, I strongly recommend that you look at the UNESCO Science Report, which focuses on the extent to which female researchers around the world are disadvantaged. And the next two infographics are taken from that report. This shows rather nicely the so-called leaky pipeline, the extent to which women's share in higher education and research falls off the further their career develops, or doesn't, as is the case. So that 53% of women at undergraduate and master's levels is a consistent figure around the world. But then there's a fall off as fewer women do PhDs, and then the real drop is shown here on this slide, that far fewer women are offered postdoctoral positions and certainly positions of leadership in science. Now, if you take that figure of 28%, that's the average share of women researchers around the world, as shown on this map here. The highest percentage is approximately 50%. Women have certainly obtained gender parity in some parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Europe. And as you can see from this slide, they're on the verge of doing so in other parts of the world, such as the Caribbean, Latin America, and Central Asia. Interestingly, the report argues that the effect in Southeast Europe is largely a consequence of those countries having formerly been in the Soviet bloc. Now, it's not just the fact that women are underrepresented as researchers. There are other aspects of academic life where women are also disadvantaged. For example, they are underrepresented as peer reviewers on editorial boards and research councils. And these are some data from that UNESCO report. So a survey of 10 high impact factor journals in these sciences show that only 16% of subject editors were female, 14% of associate editors were female, and then the figure for editors-in-chief is as low as 12%. And these are slightly old data, of course, but I think it's unlikely that they've changed dramatically. So what are some of the underlying barriers to female progression within science? Well, may I suggest that these are some of the most pertinent reasons. The first is the so-called maternal wall, the rather unfair expectation that a woman's performance will be affected by such things as the need to take maternity leave. There's the issue of the glass ceiling, the fact that institutionally women's performance tends to be more closely scrutinized than that of men. And the criteria by which performance is evaluated tends to be unfair to women. For example, the number of papers published by an individual will be affected by that person having to have taken maternity leave. And of course, if you're being unfairly evaluated, that leads to lack of recognition, and that in turn leads to fewer opportunities for research funding, which then becomes a vicious circle, because with less research funding, your performance will fall. Strikingly, as two previous speakers have already alluded to, there is little support for leadership bids, either because of frankly conscious or at least unconscious gender bias. But I just thought I'd go off a slight tangent to talk about the impact on other aspects of science, in particular, how health outcome data are understood. It is absolutely clear, a strong need for sex disaggregated health outcome data, because the failure to do so disadvantages women strongly. Women are underrepresented in clinical trials, and as a specific example that's terribly pertinent at the moment, pregnant women are rarely included in trials, in particular for vaccines. Now, here's a rather nice example of what I'm talking about. Men and women share very common symptoms of stroke. I'm sure that you'll be very familiar with those. But women also experience far more subtle warning signs, which are often ignored by their health practitioners around the world. So let me now move on to what's been happening here in the UK over the last 15 years or so. I'm referring specifically to something called the Athena Swan Charter, which evolved from two entirely separate projects which were addressing gender inequality. And for those of you who are interested, the website for the organization is shown at the bottom of the slide. The Athena Swan Charter, which was established in 2005, has a number of aims. First, to support and transform gender equality, specifically within higher education and research. Second, to encourage and recognize commitment to advancing the careers of women in STEM employment. And more recently, the principles and commitment have changed slightly so as to address gender equality more broadly across the world and not simply focusing on those barriers to progression that affect women alone. There is a very simple process of applying for and then attaining the 3 awards of Athena Swan, which is bronze, silver, and gold, that depend, and I'll be as brief as I can, that depend on firstly quantifying the amount of gender inequality in your academic department, and then putting forward a plan that is approved by the Athena Swan Charter to address those inequalities, and by explaining in an action plan what you're going to do within your department to address the issues. Provided that you achieve those objectives and then continue to improve and receive feedback from members of your department, you will then be able to progress to silver and finally to gold awards. The Athena Swan Charter has 10 principles, which are shown here on this slide. And let me just very briefly go through each of them. First, it's absolutely clear that academia, like every other aspect of life, people cannot reach their full potential unless everyone is included in those efforts. It's vitally important to address why it is that women are being lost along the career pipeline. There needs to be a clear plan to address unequal gender representation across disciplines and also those administrative and support personnel within a department. Also means, of course, tackling any gaps in gender pay. It's important to identify and then try to remove the obstacles that face women, particularly as we go back to the leaky pipeline infographic, those points in their career development and progression, such as that transition from PhD to postdoc. In this country, at least, there's major issues to do with short-term contracts and the unfairness and inequality that people feel if they're not on a long-term contract. More recently, it's been the charter has been broadened to deal with the discrimination that is often experienced by trans people, which leads on to the fact that if you genuinely wish to achieve gender inequality, equality within your department, that requires commitment and action from everyone at every single level of the organization, particularly senior members of a department or and senior members of a university. Those structural and cultural changes that need to be made have to be sustainable and have to recognize the fact that all individuals have identities shaped by many different factors. And so lastly, what I'd like to share with you is what happened within our department as we went through the process of applying firstly for a bronze award and latterly for a silver. And the action plan that was developed, which is split into these 5 domains, was brought about firstly by quantifying the extent to which gender inequality existed within the department. For example, in terms of the proportion of postdocs, the proportion of senior members of the department who were male or female, any pay disparities between people. So that was the process of quantification. And secondly, we went through a number of surveys within the department to try to give people an opportunity to express the extent to which they were happy or not with what was going on in the department. And let me just take, in the last 2 slides, just a couple of examples of themes that we addressed in the action plan. For example, the theme of career development. We aim to establish a committee of clinical and non-clinical staff to provide mentorship and provide advice to early stage researchers. And of course, we were judged as to how well that group was functioning. We arranged training for mentors and mentees so that every early stage researcher felt supported in their endeavors. And we committed ourselves to ensuring that at least 2 lecturers and research scientists had applied for senior fellowships within the time period. And we did so by distributing information about fellowship opportunities, providing mentorship, helping with grant applications, and applications for fellowships. And lastly, let me move on to a couple of other themes. The theme of the timing of meetings was terribly, terribly important, because many of the meetings that we were holding within the department were held late in the day or worse, even early evening, which was grossly unfair to those people with parental responsibilities. So we set out to regularly review the timings of those meetings and ensure that people were satisfied with the new timings. And lastly, as far as recruiting staff was concerned, we ensured that every single member of the department underwent unconscious bias training. When I say every member of the department who was involved in recruitment. And we liaise with other clinical departments within the university to think of strategies to encourage more women to apply. And of course, we judge the success or failure of that action by how many women were applying for positions. And we tried to ensure that equal numbers of qualified men and women applied for any vacant senior posts when they were advertised. So in summary, this is my message, and the message is simple. That gender equality in science is achievable, but it absolutely requires a top-down approach. It absolutely requires the organization's leadership to want it to happen. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and really rich presentations, all three. So let me see if I can turn my video on and go on to the questions. So two ways of doing this. We have a fairly large turnout of interested participants, so I'm sure there will be questions as people can raise their hands, put their questions, preferably in the Q&A mode. I have not been following the chat and I see quite a number of messages. But let me start with a question that was posted straight off the bat as Amina began her presentation. And I'll ask this for of both Amina and following her by Hoda. So the question pertains to the enormous traditions in Islam of support and history, and can history serve as a source to inspire girls in Africa to produce careers, pursue in STEM? Do you have any views on this, Amina?
I think so. I think history, we can learn a lot. I think in my presentation, I raised the issue whereby sometimes when we are taught about achievements and many things, we do not learn of the great women in our settings, the things they have done and their contribution. And therefore, every time you speak to young girls, they say we lack role models. I think both life and historical role models can play a great deal in shaping the way people think and their willingness to try out, different careers and go out for big achievements.
Hoda? The question was posed by Mohammed Banji, and it is pertaining to what are the traditions in the world of Islam that can help us in our case for promoting women in science?
Well, you see, I mean, there are lots of traditions in the world of Islam that are very beneficial to women and very positive to their health and well-being. So the problem is not in the Islam and verses and what occurred in Islam. The problem is in the social constructs that interpret the roles and responsibility. And these are changeable. And they change by society who have the same religion, and they end up with different social constructs. My key point when anyone talks to me about culture, religion, or any force that impact people, my key answer is, what is the end product of your interpretation on the well-being of the individuals? If I can show you that your interpretation is affecting the health and the well-being of individuals, you better go back and recheck your interpretation. It's not religion, it's your social construct, it's how you interpret it. And religion can never be there to hurt the well-being of individuals, any religion, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, whatever, culture, whatever, tradition. If it hurts, then something is wrong with the way we are reading it.
Absolutely true. And a related question, and I'll ask you to also maybe perhaps, Stephen, reflect on this, is, and Anil poses this, Anil Khamis, to say the re-emergence or just the becoming prominent of the Taliban in Afghanistan is a remarkable phenomenon, and something that some analysts may not have foreseen. But they, at least so far in their body language, they appear to have maybe learned over time or become a little chastened. But how do we ensure that the particular social, cultural, political economies of movements such as these, and we're talking about Afghanistan right now, but the same thing is happening in Maghreb or in other parts of Africa, where fundamentalism has grown. How do we ensure that we can certainly dialogue and produce a paradigm of women's continued education in general, and particularly women in science, that's not contradictory in any way to whatever social, cultural norms that people may have? Stephen, any views on this? And then I'll go back to our panelists. It's a contemporary one. I know it's tough.
Gosh, that's a tough question, Zulfi. How do you persuade the leaders of society that every individual within that society has a worth, irrespective of their gender, and a value to that society? I don't have an answer, Zulfi. I do not have an answer. I'm ignorant. I mean, does this come from within Islam? I mean, does the Islam which the Taliban represent, what's the best, most sensitive way of asking this question? To what extent is it representative of Islam as a whole? The attitude to women, the attitude with regard to the attitude of women.
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to that, Stephen, is it isn't. I mean, that reflects such an aberration that in the entire world of Islam, you would find that most people would not subscribe to that and would not hold those views. But the question really is to be absolutely practical, pragmatic. How does one engage? And I can see one way that people are beginning to do that with groups such as these, obscurantists as we may call them, is to use the economic argument and to use a carrot and stick approach. So the question that we have is really how does one pragmatically handle this in both Asia and Africa? Hoda, do you and Amina have any views on this?
Well, my view starts with the vision of development. I think we should open up the discourse of what is development and what it means to the individual well-being. If we can all agree that development is not about the economic indicators, it's about satisfaction of potential, is how the well-being of people. This vision of development is anchored in Islam. Islam wants you to lead a very satisfying life. It wants you to satisfy your potential. Islam mentions the word of equality in all its verses explicitly. Men and women are equal. When there are indications of different roles and responsibility, is for the purpose of well-being. If something is happening that is not satisfying this, then something is wrong. And I feel the best way to engage is to monitor the changes in health and well-being of people. I mean, as simple as that. Let's agree that your success rests on the quality of lives you provide to your people, as Stephen said, to every member of society, young, old, men, women, or whatever. If we can agree on that, and I think everybody should agree on that, then we can open the door to a discourse, because that's the goal of Islam. Nobody would that's the goal of religion. So it's just social construct. I mean, I keep going back to how people are interpreting things, and they interpret it based on their experience and what they saw in life, and what suffered, and injustices. Bhutta, let me bring in that as well. People who suffer injustices, they tend to be unjust to others. So I mean, the quality of justice to them as well is very important, because this is what creates polarization of society. This is what creates those fanatics groups.
I mean, there's clear evidence that the greater the diversity addressing any issue, be it in science or politics, government, finance, the greater the diversity of the minds that are brought to the issue, the more productive one will be. And particularly in economic terms. But how you persuade people that that is the case, that by depriving half the population of participation in these endeavors, I really struggle. I don't know.
All right. Well, I mean, we've underscored this, but just to recognize that, obviously Taliban do not represent, or at least the Talibanization and some of the precepts that they had in the past does not represent Islam. But I thought it was fair to pose this question, just given the contemporary nature of those challenges. But let's move on. And I have two specific sets of questions for the panel. One is, I mean, we frequently pay lip service to interdisciplinary research or multisectoral research. Is there a particular role that women scientists have? I know we have talked about STEM, and there is absolutely no reason why women cannot, do any discipline in science. But is there a particular role that, just given their broad understanding of some of the social underpinnings, the social determinants of health, the multisectoral nature of the sustainable development paradigm, is there a particular role that women can play, women scientists can play in interdisciplinary research? And research that is of particular relevance to the SDGs. We pass the floor to you, Amina. In your Women in Science in Africa research, are you using a restrictive definition of what kind of sciences, or are social sciences, anthropology, very much part of the same?
So actually, we are using a very broad approach to the way we look at science. So when you think of human development, which is my key area, human development is affected by biological factors, sociocultural factors, So like when we think about developing interventions, I need people with an anthropological background to understand the cultural barriers, the cultural facilitators, and practices, so that we build on the strengths that are there and we find a way to speak to communities on cultural changes where there is need. We need people who can look at genetics of issues, who take blood samples and look at the biology. So for me, science is a very multidisciplinary approach that looks at both social, cultural, geographical, and other contextual issues, which kind of makes me go back slightly to the other discussion, Zulfia. I think the way to get people to to change is really to take more of a behavioral kind of discussion. People need to be convinced on what they need to change. Culture is dynamic. We all talk of culture as if it's static. Culture is dynamic. Some things served a purpose at one point in life and they need to be dropped. But we need to understand this purpose it served and then dialogue with them on why that can no longer hold in the current setting. So I think I'm very fascinated by what I can learn from different disciplines, and I look at, so what is interesting about women in science is that especially for a long time, women stayed in humanities and social sciences, and that sometimes didn't count. It paid less. It was considered less of a science. It's what were considered soft sciences. But I think by bringing in this group and having more women also join STEM, we would have quite a dynamic contribution to, you know, the scientific output.
Right.
You know,
okay. Well, yeah. Hoda?
Can I build on that? I want to use the last statement that Stephen made, because I thought it was a lovely statement. He was saying that equality is achievable, but it requires a top-down approach. It requires a leadership who wants it to happen. The recent development thinking, is really consistent with what he's saying, because for a long time, we focus social science on changing the behavior of individuals. We focus social science on changing the community environment of people by targeting the disadvantaged. Now we're recognizing, when I said in my talk, causes of the causes and structural upstream determinant, we're recognizing that there are root causes in the governance, in the vision of development, in how the leadership acts. He mentioned this in his own domain. And we are mentioning this in the whole policy change. And the part that I feel weak in as a researcher is when I start to look at the level of policy, which is your question about Taliban. When I start to think at the macro level, how do I change the minds of the decision makers? How do I market my ideas to them? How do they allow me to get engaged in development? I mean, this whole area of research, which is more like political analysis, policy analysis, whatever, we are not very, or at least I am not very strong in it, and I find myself needing colleagues who have worked on the policy circle much more than myself. So this is an example of multidisciplinarity. I can explain the problem. I cannot really investigate how to make the change happen when I need help from other disciplines to do that.
True. I mean, and you know, I framed this question because in my personal experience, some of the best interdisciplinary research that I've seen has been led by women scientists because they have a better understanding and sometimes a better disciplinary grasp of the field. And we need more role models. We need more projects that have achieved that. Let me turn to a more contemporary issue, not the Taliban, which took such a lot of our discussion time, but COVID-19. So the pandemic has turned the world on its head. And honestly, when I look back at the last, now we're coming up to close to around 19 months, and soon there will be 2 years of the world having just stopped functioning as we knew it, and it may never return to where it was before. So in this COVID-19 reality, how have we looked at gender equity in science? Has this been, just given the reality of people have had to balance their home lives with their official life, many people working remotely, has this been a bane or a boost to women in science? I can certainly tell you from my own program, both in Pakistan and here, there were so many people working remotely that I find that this is one of the best things we could have done in terms of time distribution and encouraging women scientists to be able to work with the flexibility of hours, time, and division of labor, and for many men as well. But I think this has not been the universal experience. So can I ask the panel, as to what is your view on COVID-19 and its impact on women in science. Start with you, Stephen. Oxford has had some leading female researchers, but tell me more in general.
I have read a little around this subject, and certainly in this country, and I think in some other countries like the States, this has disadvantaged women because the pressures, for example, of homeschooling have been so intense that they haven't had time for very much else, actually, during the day.
And there is not a lot of gender equity in homeschooling.
And there's not a lot of gender equity in homeschooling, no. So I can say anecdotally, and from the little that I've read around the subject, certainly in this country, women have complained. Really, they've been unfair. The burden of much of the homeschooling online has fallen on their shoulders.
Yet the converse is also that, you know, scientists have been able to work with flexibility of hours and without the pressures of doing a 9 to 5 every day in offices. I mean, certainly in many places, the commute alone is about an hour. So it has leveled the playing field somewhat.
Yeah.
But I think your point on homeschooling is absolutely real for those who have young children. Amina, what is your view from Africa? Has COVID-19 been a big barrier to women in science, or has it opened opportunities?
I think it's double-edged. So on the short term, it's really been heavy about the caregiving, you know, at home, homeschooling, and, you know, balancing all this while you're at home. Sometimes networks don't work. Yeah? On the other hand, I hope employers have learned something from this process, that people don't have to turn up at work every day to actually achieve, and they don't have to keep to certain hours. And I'm hoping that this flexibility will allow women in the long run to be able to create a work environment that suits their needs.
And that is so true. Before I go to Hoda, one of the reasons I asked this question is because a few years ago, the whole issue of flexible training for women in clinical training programs was just not considered at all. The Aga Khan University Hospital, our own program, the Department of Pediatrics, was one of the first to introduce flexible training program for women in training in pediatrics who would otherwise have had to take a decision in terms of whether to stay in the field or not. And flexible training made that possible. So I think it's also opened the doors to many other things. Before I come to you, Diana, I want to give the floor to Hoda to see if she has a view on COVID-19 and women in science.
Well, I will speak to the equity framing I was talking about. There are different groups of women who are scientists. There are women who have very young children, and there has to be a differentiated approach to them. There are women like myself, who's retired, who's enjoying working online and from home, except for the technology disruption that you've witnessed all. But really, part of it is not to think of women in any groupings as one uniform group, and to develop special arrangements for specific different conditions so that all of them can benefit from something that has a potential value to them. So that's basically, and I think it brings in the answer of Stephen and Amina as well. I mean, it really depends on who is the scientist and where she's working. But generally speaking, Zulfiqar, just remember that I'd love, there is a webinar by someone from WHO. I'm sorry, I think his name is Mike, but I don't remember his full name. And he said it very clearly. He said that people who are dying are not dying from COVID. They are dying from the social conditions that are around COVID, whether in terms of their exposure, in terms of their ability to get the vaccines, in terms of the financial implication. So COVID is not really killing people, it's our social.
And one of the things, hopefully, Hoda, that you and I will be able to discuss at some stage is the profound gender imbalances that we still see around COVID numbers in many low and middle income countries. And that's to a large extent not really explicable outside of the social determinants of health that you talk about, because we don't see that in the West. And we see a profound gender imbalance when you come to LMICs. Diana, quickly, and then I may have a comment to round off.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important question about the impact of COVID on women. And as we've all been suggesting our views on what's happening, I would just add that whenever we talk about the implications and the solutions, we talk about the policies and the actions that both women and men together, both, you know, if the focus is always on women, then I think we neglect the really important issues from the perspective of men and what men can do side by side on childcare, on education at home, on sharing responsibilities, on changing nature of work, on commutes. All these issues are important for us to look at from both gender perspectives. And I would just encourage us to use women and men when we are talking about them so that men feel included in making some changes as well.
Absolutely. And as was pointed out in the chat by one of our participants, let me see if I can, it's Sayyida Zahra who says that whether it's COVID or not, a lot depends upon the supportive nature of family members. And that's absolutely true. If you come from a supportive family structure, then you're able to provide equitable opportunities for everybody. And we've seen it time and time again that, you know, whether it was sharing bandwidths at home on Zoom calls, who gets priority, and who gets the office and who gets to sit on the kitchen table, that this is very much a negotiation at a family level in terms of who gets the airtime and the floor. But it's also taught many people how important it is to have issues of work environment, home life, balance out, and particularly for organizations who have not thought about this, is to recognize how important it is to look at some of the big challenges and barriers that women have in their careers, particularly if they have young children. And if schools close, all of a sudden you're just depriving a whole section of the population of an opportunity for staying in the mainstream. I mean, I'm reminded, I recently read the biography of Ruth Ginsburg, of the Supreme Court, a very notable Supreme Court judge, and looking at her life story, even in our own discipline of law, even in our own discipline of having to fight cases for gender equality, that she had an uphill battle just because of social norms. And those social norms were the very norms whereby positions in certain disciplines were restricted to girls just because they were girls, not because there was any biological reason for them not to become scientists or become pilots or become, as is the case in our own country, Pakistan. For the first time, we have a woman heading the entire Armed Forces Medical Services. A Surgeon General of Pakistan, a Lieutenant General, is a woman, and that just never happened before. So those are great developments. I want to, towards the end, encourage everybody to remain engaged in this space. This is a topic whereby we are going to periodically visit this, because this is one of the main responsibilities of the Institute for Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University, is to highlight the whole issue of gender disparities in science. And we want to be able to do something about this. So watch the space, because we will be initiating a program on this before long, particularly focused on women scientists and how to encourage them at an early stage of their career in partnership with the University of Oxford. The second point that I would like to make is that there's nothing that works like advocacy. And to be aware and to break some of the stereotypes, as was pointed out by Mohammed Banji in one of his comments, that, you know, if you ask about women in nursing and leaders, global nursing leaders, many people, even in our Islamic world, will talk about Florence Nightingale. Very few people will talk about Rufaida al-Islamiyya, many of the women leaders. So highlighting some of the achievements of women leaders in science and development is also a role and responsibility of the Institute for Global Health and Development, because to look at those role models is like opening the door to many a fresh and young mind in terms of where they need to go. So I'd like to thank everybody for their participation in what has been a very important and learning opportunity for all of us. I would hope that our presenters will be able to post their presentations online in PDF form, so some of you can look at some of the concepts in greater detail. I'd encourage you to remain engaged. The Institute and its core functions is committed to a major stream of work to promote gender equity in science and development, and that's what we will do. So hopefully we'll visit this topic again in a few months, but until then, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be very keen to invite comments and any inputs that you might have. So maybe, Diana, I can pass back to you to maybe say a few words about where we are heading and other topics that we hope to engage in before long.
Thanks very much, Zulfi. Indeed, this is the 7th in the series of ongoing webinars, and I would invite everybody to be in touch with us if you'd like to recommend a topic for a future webinar, or suggest some speakers to have included. I did post the website for the Institute for Global Health and Development in the chat, and my email is there as well. So please be in touch. I think that's it for now, Zulfi. Thanks very much for your time, everybody. Thanks to our speakers and to participants for your energy.
Please help us and stay engaged with us. Thank you.